Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our webinar in celebration of Women's Equality Day, Beyond Women's Suffrage, Views from the Indo-Pacific. Today marks 101 years since women were first granted the right to vote in the United States. Several countries preceded the U.S. in extending the vote to women, with New Zealand, an Indo-Pacific country, making history as the first nation to enfranchise women in 1893. We wanted to commemorate this significant day in a new century of women's equality by reflecting on progress and remaining challenges to women's political participation in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I am Vice President at the Pacific Forum. The Pacific Forum is holding this 90-minute webinar in partnership with U.S. Indo-Pacific Command to discuss women's suffrage across the Indo-Pacific. The event will explore the suffrage movement from a historical and sociological perspective. It will also reflect on the importance of the movement to the women, peace, and security agenda, which calls for women's full and equal participation in the maintenance and promotion of peace and security, including in post-conflict democratic systems. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video-audio recording of this session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and Pacific Forum and Indo-PACOM's YouTube channels in the future. I'll also note that we have a post-event survey we'd like you to complete after the event concludes. I'll now hand over the mic to your moderator for the event, Dr. Dee Sawyers, Gender Analyst at the Office of Women, Peace, and Security at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Dr. Sawyers, if you would.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pryor, and Pacific Forum for partnering with U.S. Indo-PACOM's Office of Women, Peace, and Security to host this important discussion on the influence of gender on peace and the interrelationship between the women's suffrage movement, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, and its implementation through member nations' national action plans. 21 years ago, the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 acknowledged by member nations that war and conflict are experienced differently by men, women, boys, and girls, and overwhelmingly disadvantaged women and girls. Today, we commemorate Women's Equality Day. We have the opportunity in this forum to further explore women's full and equal participation in community and national security mechanisms to address this disadvantage through voting, political representation, and policy enactment, all to institutionalize gender equality, which is integral to the maintenance and promotion of peace. I am so very pleased today to moderate this discussion and feedback through Q&A from the audience. You may write your questions in the chat or be unmuted, and please be sure to direct your questions to a particular speaker. Now to today's session. We will begin with a keynote speech delivered from Dr. Jocelyn Barnhart, followed by presentations delivered by panelists from 3 Indo-Pacific countries that have introduced WPS national action plans: Bangladesh, Japan, and New Zealand, followed by an opportunity for questions and answers and discussions with the speakers. Today's speakers for Beyond Women's Suffrage, Views from the Indo-Pacific are Dr. Jocelyn Barnhart, Assistant Professor, University of California, Santa Barbara, as keynote speaker. Dr. Amina Mohsin, Professor, University of Dhaka. Dr. Yuriko Meguro, Professor, Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan, and Chair of Japan's Gender Action Platform. And Dr. Beth Greener, Associate Professor of Politics, Massey University. Dr. Jocelyn Barnhart will kick this event off with a keynote presentation. Dr. Barnhart is an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, focusing on international relations. She is also an affiliate with the Center for Governments of AI at Oxford University. Her work focuses on gender and war, nationalism, and the governments of emerging technologies. Dr. Barnhart has a forthcoming book, The Suffragist Peace, examining how women voters have shifted the political landscape in ways that have made war less likely between nations. Dr. Barnhart, your challenge now is to deliver on that topic in 12 minutes. Please go ahead.
I take the challenge. Let's see how I do. I'm so grateful to be with you all and to discuss this incredibly important thing. So I would like to get us started by putting the suffrage into historical context. So just I'll start with a figure which shows us one take on the spread of democracy, democratic institutions, and democracies with women's suffrage throughout the last 200 years. Obviously, democracy began to spread at the end of the 18th century and spread for almost 100 years before women in New Zealand, as was mentioned, first were incorporated into the electorate. From that point, you had this kind of complementary spread of both, right? That democracy has continued to grow. And by the 1970s, pretty much all democratic countries, allowed women a place within the electorate for national elections. But what is interesting to think about is that, while no two kind of fights for suffrage or paths to suffrage in any two countries were identical, right? In each of these countries, you had different strategies by women's groups and different lengths of fight. Switzerland took decades, where others countries achieved suffrage overnight. But so no two paths were alike. But what does seem to be one common theme is to think about kind of what the world looked like to at least kind of prominent Western suffragists before it occurred, right? So, many believed that women's suffrage was not only a path to kind of symbolic equality, right? We sometimes forget that suffrage was seen as a path to political and social change. And so there were expectations that suffrage would bring a grand era of moral reform, said The Atlantic. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, predicted a new evangel of womanhood, and that they would exalt purity and virtue and morality, and that they would lift man up into higher realms of thought and action. And so there were certainly improvements expected in the moral domain. On the international domain, there was expectations of peace and prosperity. Suffragists thought that they were winning the vote in order to bring about international change and to bring about economic prosperity. And then there were expectations for domestic change. There were expectations early on that there would be large women's political parties that would emerge around the world and that would become these formidable forces in domestic politics in countries that gave women the vote. So this was the view for some early on before suffrage. If for those who lived through suffrage at the time, however, there was a notion that potentially these hopes had been dashed. Potentially living through suffrage may have felt like a revolution in terms of gender affairs, but maybe it didn't feel like a revolution in terms of domestic, political, social or domestic and political change, right? Few women's political parties really emerged. Women voted in much lower numbers than did men. And on the whole, it was, in many ways, it was hard to distinguish women's votes from the votes of men, that it seemed as though there was not going to be remarkable distinctions, which led Harper's Bazaar, an American magazine in 1925, to question, are women a failure in politics? And this is a kind of an idea that you can see reflected even today, the notion that somehow women's suffrage had failed to achieve its original objectives. But now we know things are very different, that we are coming to know more and more, actually, that, for decades, what was perceived as a lack of real change as a result of bringing women into the electorate was not exactly accurate, right? We know that, in fact, when women were brought in, that this increased the size of government. At least we know this is true within the U.S. and in Western European states, where a lot of this work has been done, that, women actually, the budgets of governments increased. They didn't increase in all areas. In fact, there seem to be predominant increases in the areas of healthcare and in education, but no reciprocal increases in defense and military spending. So, there were significant changes that were afoot. These increases in the budget and size of government, seem to be causally related to reductions in childhood mortality, increased school enrollment, and other measures of improved welfare that were difficult to capture for a while. And but yet I think that there's just so much more work to be done to really quantify the effect of women's votes, that you have a unique set of preferences, and bringing these preferences into the electorate should have change, and it should have effects on policy. So my work has been focused on women's roles and the effect of women voters on international affairs. And this work was stimulated by one of the most consistent findings in public polling, which is that women are less likely to support the use of force than men. This has been found by countless scholars in all sorts of fields. And it has been found to, again, cross-nationally in countries around the world, you see significant differences in the levels of support that women report. It has been true cross-temporally, so it does not seem to be relegated to some cultural moment or some point in time. It seems highly, highly persistent, with the one exception being that, when you ask about conflict and the use of force for humanitarian purposes, this may be the one case in which women actually support the use of force at higher rates than men. So it is not true in all areas of potential conflict and motivations for conflict, but it is highly persistent, highly consistent finding. To be clear, to say that women, we're not saying that women are peaceful and men are warlike. Such categorical distinctions are clearly inaccurate, right? All individuals exist along a distribution of preferences. But what the research has shown is that women are more peaceful on average than men. And so if we think about how, bringing these different preferences into the electorate, if we think about how that's supposed to constrain policymaking at the international level, I've looked at a number of different cases in which we see evidence that, bringing women in can lead to the election of different kinds of leaders, right? Maybe they're going to elect more Pacific leaders. And maybe they're going to constrain the decisions and arguments of those in office. So we certainly have strong evidence and historical evidence that both of these things have been true. That once you put women into the voting populace, that politicians are going to have to think differently about some things that they do. So we gathered data to assess, to see if we were correct about this intuition, and found strong evidence, in fact, that this is the case. So if you look at democracies without women voters. So these are largely 19th century democracies, though some also obviously extending into the 20th century. We find that they are 30% more likely to start a dispute. A dispute can range from anything from a small crisis up to full-scale war. But if you only look at full-scale war, they're 130% more likely to start a war. When you compare the behavior of autocratic states, so these are, autocrats initiating conflict, they're 21% more likely to start a dispute and 73% more likely to start a war. So we conducted a whole host of statistical analyses, controlling for a whole bunch of other factors to get at these figures. But I think that the evidence is very strong about initiation. We also find that the more ingrained the democracy, the more ingrained the democratic institutions, the greater the pacifying effects of having women in the electorate, as we would expect. Also, I just want to point out, it's one thing to start a conflict, to start a fight, but that's not always how you get into fights, right? Obviously, international relations is a bilateral affair, right? So if we think about when states fight and don't fight with other types of states, we see that two autocracies are 3.6 times more likely to fight or to have a military dispute than are two democracies with women's suffrage. And two democracies without women's suffrage are 3.2 times more likely. So, the notion that we've had for so long in this in the area of international relations that spreading democracy is sufficient doesn't seem to be the whole story. So I think that there are takeaways to consider that I want to talk about for the remaining time. So the first is that, in this case, we have strong evidence that political change can be real and very significant, but hard to detect as you're living in the moment, right? Gradual change can be a big deal. But I think, lack of immediate evidence that something that revolutionary change has happened does not mean that positive change is not occurring. The main thing, I think, the main takeaway that I think has been drastically underappreciated in both the academic world and in the policy world is that who votes matters. We've long had this idea that democracy in itself is the magic bullet, and that giving the vote is, setting up democratic institutions is a path to peace and so many other things. But spreading democracy, if our analysis is correct, is not enough, right? You have to ensure that you are spreading institutions and ensuring that, and acknowledging that different voters have different preferences, right? And so you must be wary of the preferences of those who get the vote. And the third is obviously an idea that many here are I would imagine, sympathetic with, that safeguarding democratic institutions is not only about the domestic politics, right? As this research has shown, and in so many other areas, we know that it has international implications. So that, we must ensure that, democracy is upheld, and backsliding obviously is not just corrosive to those within the country, but it can be corrosive across international borders. So I greatly look forward to hearing from others and to discussing.
Wow, I think you did it. Great job. Thank you, Dr. Barnhart, for that informative speech about the democratic peace and the empirical evidence that your research so much magnifies for the inclusion of women in the formula for peace. I really enjoyed your research. Next up, we have Dr. Amina Mohsin. Dr. Mohsin teaches at the Department of International Relations at the University of Dhaka. She graduated from the same department and later received her MA and her PhD degrees from the University of Hawaii and Cambridge University in the UK. Amina has received several national and international fellowships, which include the East-West Center Graduate Fellowship, CETA International Fellowship, Commonwealth Staff Fellowship, and the SSRC Fellowship and Freedom Foundation Fellowship. She writes on rights, gender and minority, state, democracy, civil military relations, borders, and human security issues. Dr. Mohsin, if you would.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And what I'm going to basically talk about is, how to localize and root the women, peace and security agenda within the context of Bangladesh. And Bangladesh takes, for Bangladesh, it is a moment of, I would say, great pride, because at this point of time, we are celebrating 50 years of our independence. And as many of you over here would be aware that, Bangladesh attained its independence after a long, 9 months long liberation war. And I think it was one of the first successful cases of independence after the colonial movement. I mean, Bangladesh went through 2 phases of independence. First in 1947, when the partition of India took place, and again in 1971. So Bangladesh has a long civilizational history, I would say. And in that context, I would like to point out that the territory where Bangladesh is located today is one where one has seen a tradition of women leadership. right from the, like from with the Mughal period also, there were women leadership. During the British anti-colonial nationalist movement, women were actively part of the nationalist movement. And then again in the during the 1971 liberation movement, women were actively part of this movement. So within this context, I would like to say that, this is a region which comes with a tradition of women leadership and women active participation in political movements. And I want to emphasize on the point, active participation. That's why when we talk about, localization and rooting women, peace and security agenda in Bangladesh, it is within this context, how the country is situated. I mean, on the one hand, you can see a history of women leadership and women involvement in these movements. On the other hand, Bangladesh had experienced conflict in 1971. And this people of this region had experienced conflict again back in 1947 also. So Bangladesh can be categorized as a country which is post-conflict, but at the same time, it is a stable democracy at this point of time. And Bangladesh, in fact, it pioneered the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And Bangladesh adopted the women or launched the Women, Peace and Security Agenda as its national action plan in 2019. And Bangladesh's agenda is based on 4 pillars, that is participation, prevention, protection, and relief and recovery. I'll just emphasize on touch on the major points because of the lack of time. So if one talks about participation, I would like to point out that Bangladesh has been ranked 7th in terms of political empowerment by the Global Gender Gap report in 2020. And Bangladesh, at this point of time, I mean, in our current parliament, about 20% of the decision makers are women. And Bangladesh has a parliament, a 300 members parliament with 50 reserved seats for women. But even within that 300, women can contest directly in the elections. And as our keynote speaker rightly pointed out, that it matters that who votes. And in Bangladesh, we have seen that increasingly since 2008, there is an increasing rise in the number of women voters. And I mean, and we do have disaggregated data on this count. And also, we have very strong local government mechanisms where we find that 3 seats are reserved for women who are elected by direct votes. But having said that, there are certain caveats, like with the 50 reserved seats. I mean, the women who occupy the 50 reserved seats, they are not directly elected, as is understood that these are reserved seats. But the problem is that these women do not have any territorial constituencies. Rather, they are elected by the elected members of the parliament. So if you do not have territorial constituencies, it does limit your power and how you participate. And also in the constitution, we have the Article 17, which prohibits floor crossing. So there is you can discuss on issues, but in terms of voting, if you vote against your party, you lose your membership in the party. So that is a major setback. So Article 70 is there. And with the local government also, the problem side is that, the entire idea was decentralization. But recently, the local government has been brought under the political ambit. that you have to have nomination through a political party. So it defeats the very concept of decentralization, and women from grassroots levels really cannot participate in the sense that they do not, I mean, they can get elected, but it is very hard for the women from the grassroots levels who do not have connections to get nominations. So I just want to make these points clear that though there are things that are in principle there, but there are certain limitations also. And also a major limitation, though the Constitution provides equality in all spheres of life, public and private, but we still do have the personal law. So that personal law, the existence of personal law, it limits women in certain, in many areas, in the sense that, like the private sphere, in the private sphere, women's rights are curtailed in terms of equal right to property, equal family laws, because if you are following the family law, it is guided by your culture, religion, and tradition. So that thing is there. One has to keep note of that. But having said that, again, I would say that Bangladesh has made significant advances given the traditional patriarchal structure, because one has to keep in mind, if you look at the present parliament, our leader of the opposition is a woman, the leader of the house is a woman, the speaker of the parliament is a woman. And as I pointed out, that 20% of this parliament constitutes of women. And since 1991, Bangladesh has been ruled by women leadership. So this is very significant in a patriarchal structure like Bangladesh, where because, despite being a Muslim majority country, we see that women voters are there and women leadership is there. So that is very significant. One needs to keep that into context also. In terms of prevention, we find that in violent extremism, Bangladesh government has taken a zero tolerance policy on violent extremism. Bangladesh government has taken a zero tolerance policy on violence against women also. And the counter-terrorism and transnational crime unit, which is in charge of taking care of the violent extremism, it has in fact cooperated with the academia, with civil society organization, and gender has been taken as a gender mainstreaming has been taken as one of the policies. And I personally am involved in research on violent extremism and gender and violent extremism. That's why I can say this with confidence and responsibility. And coming back to the protection side, again, I would say that there is zero tolerance on violence against women. We have seen that during the pandemic period, violence against women has increased globally, and Bangladesh has been no exception to this. But Bangladesh government, there are very strong laws on the laws on prevention against violence against women and children. I'll just conclude here. And on the last point, the relief and recovery, that Bangladesh, being a disaster-prone country, has a mainstream gender in the disaster management program. And we are also hosting 1.1 million refugees in Bangladesh, 55% of whom are women and children. I will just stop here. Thank you.
That's great. I'm so glad that you got those last points in. So I thank you for addressing the political representation in Bangladesh and also the policy work that you're doing for human security. Thank you so much. All right, so let's continue the narrative with Dr. Eureka Meguro. Dr. Eureka Meguro is a professor emeritus of Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan, and chair of Japan's Gender Action Platform. She holds a PhD in sociology from Chase Western Reserve University and introduced women's studies, later changed to gender studies, to Japanese academia, and established the sociology of gender in Japan. She has undertaken research on gender roles and power relations in changing societies. She has received numerous honors and awards, including the Japanese Prime Minister's Award for contribution to the promotion of gender equal society. And most recently, the Autumn Conferment of Decoration for many years of contribution to promote gender equality in 2020. Dr. Yoriko Meguro, please go ahead. I think you're muted.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much again for your very kind introduction. And I'm very glad that I was invited to this panel discussion because it's a great opportunity to share the experiences about our own countries and our histories. I titled this presentation, No Equality Without Peace, No Peace Without Equality. And I'm going to talk about Japan's experience. The external impact is a key to Japan's social change, particularly in terms of gender equality. Japan experienced 2 stages of women's movements aiming at realizing gender equality in the past 100 years. The first stage was from roughly 1920s to 1945. In this period, Japan was in the process of modernization and westernization. And some intellectual women recognized and articulated the existing gaps between women and men as unfair. Among those women leaders, Husae Ichikawa was a pragmatic activist. She went to the United States as a special reporter of the Yomiuri newspaper from July 1921 to December 1923, visiting from the West Coast to the East through the Midwest, researching and interviewing on women's issues and labor issues to send report to the Yomiuri newspaper. She utilized this schoolgirl license. I didn't know anything about that. The schoolgirl license to stay longer in the States to attend the classes in schools. What she learned during her stay was the behavior pattern of American women in their political participation at that time. She was interested in learning how the women would exercise the political right to vote, which they were gained in 1920. She reported to Japan that as soon as the women obtained the right to vote in America, they changed the name of their association, the organization, so that its mission was to exercise the right by way of citizenship education. Meeting with Alice Paul was critical for Ichikawa's decision to concentrate on women's suffrage only, while she was working on women's labor issues as well. They met in Washington, D.C. in 1923. Ichikawa was invited by her to stay in her party, Women's Party, for 2 weeks. Alice Paul advised Ichikawa that only women could commit to women's suffrage movement and that Ichikawa should do it in Japan. After she returned to Japan, she worked at ILO Tokyo office which she helped to open, and was engaged with a series of surveys on the working conditions of women workers in the coal mines and spinning factories. She finally decided to leave ILO to concentrate on the Women's Suffrage Union or the Alliance in 1927. Ichikawa was on the move right after the declaration of Japan's defeat in the Pacific War. 2 months later, she organized the new Japanese Women's Union to continue the pre-war women's suffrage movement. Since Japan surrendered unconditionally, she knew that women's suffrage would come to be a reality in Japan. She lobbied several political influencers to take initiative to include women's suffrage in Japan's post-war policies. The new cabinet agreed to include women's suffrage in their proactive policy and the Prime Minister Shidehara made it open to the press. At his meeting with General MacArthur, some of you may know his name, the Prime Minister told the General about it, which pleased him, but the part of women's suffrage could not be found in the General's memoir. Later on, evidence was found that the inclusion of women's suffrage was first decided by the Japanese government. So it's a very important thing who did it first. Women in Japan exercised their suffrage for the first time on April 10, 1946. About 13,800,000 women voted, and 33 women were elected to be the first female parliamentarians. Women decision makers in the political sector have never been reached the level of power balances since then. As for Ichikawa, she stayed in civil society for the first election. But with her supporters' request, she became a parliamentarian for the rest of her life. There is no equality without peace, and there is no peace without equality is her message to the young generation in her speech in 1980. So another message is do not sit on the right. I don't know if you can get the meaning by this expression, but don't sit on the right. This was meant to be to the all women in Japan, because she was frustrated that women are given the right to vote, and yet are they really utilizing the right? And they have to work hard in order to have it functioning. Let's see. Japan's global gender gap index ranking in 2020 was 120th of 152 countries, which was the worst since the ranking started. And it is 120th this year, the second worst. The low score in the political sector contributes to the total low score. So the low score in the political sector is very critical. The second stage of movement, this is going to be making it very short. The second stage of movement was from 1960s to 1999, very specific. The second wave of feminist movement in the Western world was introduced to Japan, and women were considered those women who considered gender roles should be flexible and changeable were active in vocal about eliminating gender gaps. Lowering birth rate became a political issue. Understanding reproductive health and rights became a dividing line between the fixed gender role believer and flexible gender role believer. Value gaps became less generational, but more diverse. The product of the movement was the basic law on gender equality society. This was established in 1999. That's why I said it, 1999. And its five-year action plans became a policy framework, which made the negotiation between the government and the civil society more formal and, in a way, more transparent. At any rate, if we have exercised our right to vote effectively during this time, we must have had more women represented in the political sector. We may have been sitting on the right to vote, as Ichikawa said. Women globally have similar reasons why they cannot be candidates. To begin with, the major obstacle is, I think, very restrictive. The major obstacle is the election system we have. If so, then I think more women can participate, at least in discussion, and to change the election system. Lastly, time is up. Lastly, very few comments on WPS. This is very important. Japan came up with the National Action Plan in 2015, 15 years after the WPS resolution was adopted at the Security Council. Of course, we, the civil society women, pushed it to get it done. Its structure is composed of 5 pillars, like participation, prevention, protection, humanitarian and recovery support, and monitoring and evaluation. And so under this monitoring and evaluation, we have established a review committee, of which I'm a member. And I wouldn't go into the detail of the substantive part, but we had the second version 2 years ago, and for the first years, we were asked to review and pick up, review all the projects and review and select model cases. But it wasn't really, we couldn't really do the review as it is defined. And in 2020, we had the second version. And it is more clear that the aim of this NAP, National Action Plan, is for the gender mainstreaming of everyone.
I think that's great. I'm going to have to cut you off now, but thank you so much.
You.
I'm really I've read the National Action Plan. You really are making great strides. And thank you so much for your historical perspective on flexible gender roles. And I really appreciate your work that you've done in your country. Really impactful. And now we're moving on. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Beth Greener. Dr. Greener is an associate professor of politics at Massey University in New Zealand. Her research has traditionally focused on how states and others seek to provide for security and what this means for world order. She has authored books on international policy, policing, police and military roles and peace and stability operations, and edited collection on the New Zealand Army. Her more recent research focuses on issues pertaining to gender and security, with a particular interest in gender issues in military context and the women, peace, and security agenda. Dr. Greener, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome from New Zealand, which is right down the end of the world at the present time and likely to stay there as well. I'm very thrilled to be able to talk to you today. As has been mentioned a couple of times already, we're exceptionally proud and privileged in this country to be the first state to have officially granted women the vote. So I'll briefly talk through some of that historical context before talking about some more recent initiatives as well, and I'll try and keep an eye on the time. So I'm going to bookend this session like we began with sharing my screen and working through a PowerPoint. We'll see if this works properly. You can let me know what you're seeing at this stage. I will move to here. And let's see if I can resume slideshow. So is this working, Dee? Fantastic. Okay, so looking at beyond women's suffrage, I've also got here, we're talking about views from Aotearoa, which is the Māori word for New Zealand, or land of the long white cloud. And I think that's an important part of our history that's developing, is that a lot of our discussion around gender is becoming increasingly recognizing the importance of intersectionality, particularly in our national context. So I thought I'd briefly talk about some of those milestones. Again, to reiterate, after years of petitioning, many years of petitioning the government for women to have the right to vote, by 1893, the suffragettes here had managed to get 1 in 4 New Zealand women to sign a petition. So a quarter of the female population was agitating for the right to vote. There'd been a number of rounds of petitions, and it was beginning to become untenable to resist, basically, at this stage. So on the 19th of September, we see an electoral law brought into being that gives all women over 21 who are British subjects the right to vote. And this is very much an important juncture, in particular because it also gives Māori women the right to vote, but it nonetheless still has some exclusionary clauses, such that Chinese immigrant women, for example, were still not able to vote under that system. And we're quite familiar in New Zealand with the first face of these photos here. That's Kate Shepherd, who led the suffragette movement. Indeed, she's on our $10 note. So, and indeed, we often learn about her work and the work of the suffragettes in our history classes in high school. But at the same time, increasingly, we're recognizing that there was other work going on by other really important women, and in particular, trying to recapture the work of Māori women who were really active in this space as well. So in that same year, we have Mary Tatai Mankahia, who is petitioning the Māori Parliament, not just for the right to vote, but actually for the right for women to stand for election. She was unsuccessful in that endeavour, but by 1919, New Zealand women have the right to vote and to stand to be members of Parliament. And we see our first female minister, Elizabeth Coombs, in Parliament in 1933. So it still took 40 years to get women into positions of power. Our first cabinet minister follows shortly after the Second World War. But what's also really apparent when we look at the history of New Zealand is that progress was quite slow. It was really quite incremental. So those 5 women in the picture at the bottom there, the sole members of Parliament. Sorry, I've got Minister for Parliament written there, members for Parliament in 1981. So making up a whole 9% by 1981. So we're talking about almost a century of being enfranchised, but yet the ability to participate or to be able to represent was still really quite minimal. And that
changes is really interesting to follow on from Professor Maguro's presentation, because one of the main reasons why that changes is because of the change in our electoral system. So in 1993, I'm just saying I can't seem to move this along. Hang on a second. In 1993, New Zealand actually goes to the polls in a referenda and votes for a new political system. We used to have a first past the post system, but in two elections, 1978 and 1981, we actually ended up with a national government both times, despite the fact that more of the population voted for Labour. So there was a lot of consternation and frustration in the New Zealand constituencies about where their vote was going. And this helped to motivate a shift to a new proportional representative form of voting. So in New Zealand, when we go to the polls, we vote twice. We vote both for our party that we want to have representatives in Parliament, and we vote for our local member that we want to see representing our electorate, so that territorially based constituency. And this had a massive impact immediately, as a lot of the literature talks about proportional representation helping to bring women and minorities into government. And in 1996, there was a huge shift such that we have 35 women MPs, making up 30% of Parliament. In 1993 elections, there were 20% women, and the one before that, about 16%. So it did have a significant impact on representation. By 97, we have our first female prime minister. It happens internally. She's not elected popularly. It's a party coup. But by 1999, we have our first female prime minister, and Helen Clark is in for a long time, in for 3 terms, so 9 years. And as you can see from that picture on the right-hand side, we've now had 3 female prime ministers, Jenny Shipley, Helen Clark, and of course, Jacinda Ardern. So what we have now, as of the 2020 elections last year, 58 women were elected, and they make up 48% of our parliament now. So it's quite a substantial change from what we were seeing previously. And again, I think largely due to electoral reform. But we've also seen a number of women in particularly important authority positions. So there are a number of constitutional roles here in New Zealand, such as the Prime Minister, Governor General, Speaker of the House, Attorney General, and Chief Justice. And those positions have all now been held by women at different times. This year, we have the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the Governor General, the Chief Justice, and also a really important figure at the moment is our Foreign Minister. And Anaya Mahuta is really significant, not just because she's Māori, not just because she's a woman, but because she's Māori. So she's Wahine Māori. And she has said that she's going to bring that positionality to her involvement in foreign affairs. I think the other part of the puzzle, so there's one structural change that's happened, the electoral reform system. But there's another structural change that occurs, and I think that's down to our engagement with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So we've seen increasing numbers of women being involved in certain agencies, and police and military roles in particular, and also we've seen increased gender mainstreaming, the idea of implementing a gender perspective, those sorts of initiatives happening across government departments when they're thinking about planning and implementation of different programs. And I think the really significant thing to suggest is that National Action Plan has been really helpful for those in those agencies and those government departments to be able to hang their objectives on, or to demonstrate that they need to be meeting certain objectives because they're in a strategy, they're in a strategic plan. And so we'll talk about where we are at the moment. So what we've seen then is we were quite late to the fray. Similarly, 2015 is when we signed a National Action Plan. I think there was a little bit of complacency in New Zealand that we do gender well. Perhaps we may not need an NAP straight away. But it was actually really important to go through the process of drawing up the NAP because, again, it made things very transparent and it demanded a degree of accountability from different agencies. And what's quite apparent is that although sometimes there's a lot of rhetoric, there's not necessarily a huge amount, particularly of budgetary support, because some of the initiatives that would go into supporting increased gender equality. So the 2 main focus for our first National Action Plan was increasing the number of women in the police and the military, trying to increase the number of senior women in those agencies, so to look at who could be promoted and how, whether or not there were gendered barriers to promotion, and also to deploy women increasingly offshore when we were engaged, particularly in peace and stability operations. So that was the first main thread. The second was to support diplomatic efforts that were being made through the UN and other organizations that would align with the demands of the WPS agenda. So for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here to try and support gender-based initiatives. There have been some successes. I've tried to list a couple of figures here. So one of the things to note is that we are aiming informally, there's no quota system, but there is a drive within the Defence Forces and within the police to increase gender diversity and diversity more generally. Currently sitting at about 14% women in the Army, 20% in the Air Force, 24% in the Navy. The last two, the Air Force and the Navy, are seeing these numbers increase quite quickly. And Army is working really hard to try and improve their numbers as well. There's also has been evidence of increased seniority. For example, there were no brigadiers in the Army in 2014, no female brigadiers, and now we have 3. And what's really important is this year we got our very first G list or generalist female officer being made a brigadier. Previously, the other 2 were specialists, and that's quite important symbolically within the Army. Within the police, women make up approximately 20% of the police, and that is growing very quickly. So, for example, in the last couple of years, some of the recruit intakes have been more than 50% women. And that's up from a measly 6% in 1989, when we seemed to believe that you needed to be 6'4" and male in order to do the job, and 13% in 1995. And again, seniority has improved. We currently have an assistant commissioner, a number of women deployed offshore. Our numbers in that front, though, are a little bit misleading. We're only deploying small numbers. So it's very easy for us to meet 20, 30% deployed when we only have a handful of people offshore. Also, very recently, about a month ago, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs launched its Gender Action Plan, where it's seeking to increase funding on gender-centric official development, overseas development aid, to 4%. So trying to really pin some funding to particular initiatives, and also what they call gender significant investment, up to 60% of our overseas development aid. So there's, again, maybe there's some resources coming in here. Okay, so I will just come to the last slide. So I think what I think is really important is that there's more work to do. I like the idea that one of the things we need to be is humble in recognizing that I think everybody still has work to do, and New Zealand is no exception. We have the highest domestic violence rate in the OECD. Typically, we have around 20 to 25 women killed in the home each year, about 9 children, and there's some fairly significant issues ongoing. We do have a gender pay gap that is also intersectional. So Pākehā women, women of European descent tend to be less, well, statistically speaking, less worse off than Māori and Pacific women who only earn 15% less than male counterparts. The other thing that we've really noticed is the impacts of COVID. I think this is yet to be really gripped up, to be honest, here. So in the first quarter of 2020, that's just an example, 11,000 jobs were lost, 10,000 of those were held by women. There was a similar repetition in another quarter just recently, and the reinvestment that's being made is in the construction industry, which of course is quite male gendered. So tourism and hospitality are key industries here. Currently, as you might have noticed, we're very locked down. So these are industries that are struggling right now and very heavily gendered. And the one which I find particularly frustrating is that our National Action Plan went from 2014 to 2019. There was an evaluation of this early last year. We've got really interested and engaged civil society members wanting to kind of engage with this new National Action Plan. Foreign Affairs has not produced this document as of yet, and it's starting to really we find it quite stressful as we're trying to advocate for a new NAP. My understanding is Foreign Affairs is under a huge amount of strain right now, so there's perhaps some explanation for this, but it's nonetheless something which I think we need, because it is something which I have seen some women time and time again pull out of the drawer and say, it's in the document, we need to be doing it, we need to prioritize it, rather than just saying we are. So thank you. I will stop share and pass back to you, Dee.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Greener, and you win for presentation skills and technical abilities. So we'll pass that medal off to New Zealand here when we're done. Thank you to our keynote speaker and panelists for all your excellent presentations, all of which amplify the importance of women's suffrage in the Indo-Pacific region, enforced with research, which provides identifies how the inclusion of women in institutions of governments really has impacted maintenance and promotion of peace. And the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 through our partner nations' national action plans, so well articulated today. And I really appreciate your background that you give on your regions and your challenges and your victories. I appreciate that transparency. The efforts by our partner nations mirror the strategic objectives and the frameworks of women, peace, and security in our office and our global goals of participation of women in peace and security, protection of women and girls from violence, inclusion of women in conflict prevention, and the all-encompassing inclusion of a gender perspective of everything that we do in our peace and security efforts here at Indo-PACOM. And I think that's something that we all share in common, is that infusion of the gender perspective in what we do. In our remaining time together, let's move on to the Q&A and discussion portion of our presentation. We have probably about 25 minutes, I think, for questions and feedback. Let me go over the Q&A procedures. You have two options for asking questions or making comments. One is to raise your hand in the webinar controls. This is accessible from the participants tab, and the other is to open the Q&A window. To ask a question, you can type your question in the Q&A box and click send. If you raise your hand to ask your question verbally, the host will enable your microphone and ask you to unmute yourself. Please be ready to unmute yourself and state your affiliation. And let's see. I wanted to ask Dr. Barnhart a question first off the bat. And so I want to ask, and I get to do this because I'm the moderator. Do you think that the connections between women's political participation and conflict prevention are becoming more widely acknowledged, both in academia and among policymakers? And especially, I'm interested in political leaders and political parties.
Over to you. Thank you for the question. So the question is acknowledgement of this important connection. I mean, I think, you know, it is and it isn't. I don't know if I have a kind of sense of relative levels of acknowledgement. I mean, on the one hand, we see UN 1325 suggesting serious acknowledgement, which is coming a long way. I think, you know, in other cases, you know, I think it's rarely acknowledged at all and seen to be secondary, right? And we see cases of, you know, U.S. and in particular state building actions it's engaged in, right? If we think about the case in Iraq, or, you know, we think about constitutions that U.S. policymakers have been involved in and devising in other countries, it has not been acknowledged as a significant factor, right? That it's actually been something that, you know, women's roles, I can't remember in the Iraq constitution, that it was, you know, what was stated was that they would promise to pay attention to women and their equality, right? So essentially, you know, there's a lot of lip service. So I don't know if I really have a notion of kind of where we're at, but I know that lip service still pervades. And so I think that there's one can acknowledge and still not act upon, I think. So there's a lot more work to be done there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your answer. I think we have a hand raised. Can you identify yourself, come off mute? Crystal, I don't see that question. Do you?
She may not be able to unmute.
Maybe not unmute. You can also type it in the chat if you would like to. Ariel has a question to panelists. But I do not see it. But I have another question, so I'm just going to go off of some of the ones that I had, because I get to, because I'm the moderator. Dr. Mohsin, I have a question for you. You talked about domestic barriers to change, even though some of your laws are pretty inclusive and power mechanisms or power distribution mechanisms for the populace. In what ways can women's political participation advance the peace and maybe challenge some of those domestic barriers? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And women's, coming directly to your question, women's political participation, as I pointed out, that Bangladesh has a long history of women's political participation. And see, one has to look at I think in answering some of the questions or contextualizing it, one has to look at the political culture of the region. And that is very important. I mean, one is often asked, I'm often asked this question, that Bangladesh being a Muslim majority country, how come you have, women leadership and women participation and women voters? As I pointed out, that increasing number of women voters we can see since 2008. But again, the brand of Islam or the way Islam is practiced in Bangladesh, it is very different from the way it is practiced in maybe the Middle Eastern countries. We have a culture which is more prone towards pluralism and inclusion. And but again, like the cultural barriers that are coming, that those are more like we can see that there is a rise of a particular, increasingly there is a rise of a particular brand of or school of Islam all over the world. You can see this trend, and particularly because from Bangladesh, migrant laborers go to the Middle Eastern countries and they come back with that version of Islam. So that is one barrier, but that is not something which is embedded in the society. But because in the constitution we have the provision of personal laws, that is a major problem, as I pointed out. But women leadership helps, because we have found that it is, again, I don't want to go into that binary of women versus men. But having said that, there are certain issues where women come together, like on the question of violence against women, on the question of refugees, like how you approach the issue. And then again, the issue of looking at a problem from a women's perspective, not necessarily a feminist perspective, but from a women's perspective, that is critical. So, those things matter. And also the women leadership, the current women leadership in Bangladesh had been part of the political movements. Like she's the daughter of the father of the nation who was involved in the liberation movement, and she as a student was in part of the students movement. So she comes back with lot of that kind of engagement. But having said that, again I would say that like it is very difficult to do away with the personal laws because of the arithmetic of the political situation. And as was pointed out by our speaker panelist from New Zealand, that the electoral system is important. We have a majoritarian electoral system. We follow the Westminster model. So if you have if you have a system where winner take it all, then it is very difficult to bring about changes in the constitution. So I think that is the major barrier. Unless we change the constitution in the electoral system in some way and bring about a proportional electoral system where minorities are equally represented, if not equally, like proportionally represented, I don't think we can bring about these changes. But it matters because when women are there in power, we have seen that incremental changes are being brought about. I'm saying incrementally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's true when we look at all of our countries, and certainly the perspective today provided to us about the suffrage movement and how a lot of people have said, well, that really didn't do anything. And really the research now shows what a gift, that really is the ground zero really for institutional change through political mechanisms. I mean, that really is the way to do it, even though all of us have somewhat different systems. It is leads to representation. Thank you very much. Dr. Meguro, I have a question for you about Japan. Given your participation and so much instrumental in the design and development of policy in Japan, how have perceptions of gender, women's rights, and women's political participation evolved? From your historical perspective, can you see the evolutionary progress from your earlier works, and any words of wisdom that you might have for us? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. In terms of the progress, I think the progress has been, should not be negated. We do have progress, but the speed is very slow. It takes time, so much time. And I keep saying, lots of my generation say, I wonder if this and this will be achieved before I die, and so it takes time. However, there is a particular observable change regarding gender equality. There is a larger number of men recognizing the significance of gender equality. It's not only young women, but men as well. And so when you talk about gender equality and gender disequality or inequality, they just take it for granted, and gender equality is the thing that we have to live with. And also the recent youngsters cannot have good lifelong jobs like their father's generation and grandfather's generations. And therefore they have to worry about their own living and some of them cannot qualify the demand that younger women have in terms of mate selection. And so in this sense, young women are more traditional that men are the breadwinners. Although in other sectors, they want their own liberty and freedom. And so in a way, the changes are there. And so it's a good thing. And also only in recent years, some business sectors people are really visibly changing because they finally realized that they cannot be hung up to the old successful ways of doing business. So they are trying to change the way of doing business. And so there are some changes, and we can feel that there is a different kind of wind blowing slowly, but so some of us are saying that, okay, we just push them into the corner. Now it's the time. And so, but that is a progress. But we need the leaders to make up their mind and decide. And they should be brave enough to take the responsibility of the failure. And that's what they are lacking. But that's a rough description of what's going on now. And also, I should not forget that there was a law on promoting women's political participation 3 years ago. And this year, we had a revival. So it's making a progress. But the thing is, all the political parties are supposed to select the candidates, women candidates, more than 30% of women, if possible. But many of the parties are saying, well, but we can't find good, right candidates. And so they are still struggling, I hope. So. But there is a hope.
Yeah, but I'm glad, I couldn't leave the session without some sort of hopefulness. I know. We do have a question in the Q&A chat from Hannah Cole. And this question is for Dr. Greener. The United States is infamous for its aging body. Oh, this is tough. For its aging body of male legislators, many of whom are incumbents maintained by gerrymandering. Would you be able to speak more to the development and implementation of the local representation you mentioned of New Zealand? Could this implementation in a larger scale be applied in the United States? How can we get more women through this system?
Thank you. That's not a small question, but I think the thing in the New Zealand context is to remember, the issue of scale is relevant. We're 5 million people. We were 3 at the time of the referenda that were held. So, and essentially what had happened, it had become intolerable that we were having these elections and not delivering the government that had the most votes. So under pressure, the government of the day in 1992 agreed to run 2 referenda. The first was non-binding, but it was to get an indication from the public as to what they thought about the current electoral system. And almost 85% of the public said they did not want the first past the post system. And they were given choices as to which of the options. So there was STV as well, single transferable vote, and also MMP were the 2 main competitors. And more than 70% of New Zealand voted for MMP as the serious competitor. The following year, we went to another referenda, which was binding. And that referenda, as she was quite close, it only ended up with 54% in favour of changing the system. I think when it got down to the end, everyone kind of panicked and thought, wait a minute, do we really want to commit? But it went through. It's also survived a challenge via referenda, again, where people have said, should we get rid of it and go back to first past the post? And it's managed to stay in situ. And the thing, it is phenomenal when you look at the literature. It does talk about, that proportional representation does challenge, or it makes it likely that the pale, male and stale will move, and that you will end up with much more representative government. And that is certainly something which has been absolutely confirmed in our case. And particularly with regards to minorities as well as women, it's been really important to see increased representation across the board. And so any party in New Zealand that gets more than 5% of the vote will enter into Parliament. And so that's quite significant when we begin to have coalition making, where you may need, the one seat in the House, you may need them to form a viable government. So we do end up, it's been really interesting. It also came after a time of the mid-1980s where the government could basically just push through any reform it wanted to without resistance. And we were known as Chile without the gun, because of how much we feasted in neoliberal economic policies. We flipped from a very subsidized, heavy, very state-regulated economy to a very, very open economy within, a very quick time frame. And that was enabled because the system didn't have any checks. So I'm sorry, I don't know how to solve your issue. We do look at gerrymandering from here, and kind of it's astounding. And just the electoral college system as well is really quite just so particular. But I must admit, I think if there could be more education and more interest in what types of electoral systems result in what types of government, because one of the things that we also see is there has to be a lot more bipartisan politicking, which is great, because oppositional politics is so damaging. I lived in Australia for years, and the style of politics was very, very much more combative. And it makes it really hard to then also, potentially admit that other parties might have things right, those sorts of things. So I think that's a really feminist kind of ethos as well, that kind of decision making. Sorry, I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I cannot solve your problem, but I think looking into alternative systems, whatever they may be, could be a way to really advance, women's participation in particular.
I think that gets at to the participation of people in voting just across the board. I know in the United States, an informed participation for sure, to understand how government works. It's appalling for people's lack of knowledge about their own government and how it works. So I don't know if you have that challenge in other countries, but in ours, I think we're severely challenged. And speaking of, go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add a thing note to that? That's one of the things that in New Zealand, I think there's a lot of emphasis on attempts to get people engaged. So we have these, and we've gone for social media, we've gone for all sorts of fun quizzes that you can do when you're a teenager at high school as to who you might vote for, depending on what policies you like. But it's an attempt to kind of, engage. So there's, a vote compass, where if you don't know who to vote for, they'll take you through some choices and those sorts of things to try and popularize it. Sorry, I'm going to stop now.
No, I think that's a great idea, because really you should look at policies and platforms. Start there and see what's important to you. All right, so I have a question in the chat, and Dr. Barnhart, I'm going to pitch this to you, and then any other panelists can weigh in on this. This is an interesting perspective. It says not all women want or believe in women's suffrage. What are the implications of this for the broader debate on suffrage?
I would have to imagine that in areas in which you don't have, it's going to depend on what proportion of a population those women make up, right? I think to get the vote, it usually takes a fight, it takes serious commitment and resolve, and it can take broad numbers. I think even, so I think, depending on how much opposition there is to suffrage amongst women, that could have a serious impact on the spread of democracy. one would imagine that that might be true most in places where there are not active democratic institutions. I'm not exactly sure how the data would lay out as to where such women would be most likely to exist. So you'd kind of have to get a sense of that before you could really, say something about how those attitudes may or may not affect policy. But one could certainly imagine that in high enough numbers that if there's not a consensus that a fight is worth it, then such a fight would not occur. So I'm not exactly sure. I hope others have things to add on that.
Anybody else on the panel want to take a stab at that?
Can you please repeat the question? I mean, I just couldn't hear it clearly.
The writer says that not all women want or believe in women's suffrage. What are the implications of this for the broader debate on suffrage and for pursuing global gender equality? How does that impact women's rights, do you believe?
I don't know from where this question is coming, but from wherever this question is coming, I mean, one needs to, given my own experience and having worked with women at the rural level, as well as, having worked in the South Asian context also. So I found that even if we take the case of Afghanistan, I've found that women really want to vote, and they want to articulate their voices. I mean, it is the context might be different, the institution might be different, but they do want to come in. And I'll just want to give one example that once I observed that, this was outside Dhaka, which is the capital city where I'm sitting now, in a semi-urban area or a peri-urban area, what you call in America, peri-urban area. I found that women were holding on to each other. They were standing in a queue. And because I was doing a research on women pattern of voting and how women canvass during the election period, and I asked them that why they are holding on to each other. They said, because we do not want to, if we leave each other, maybe some men would come and occupy our position. So we are just holding on to each other in one queue so that we can just go and vote. So, I mean, that's what I have found I can't speak for others, but the areas where I have worked, and since I had access to women networks in Afghanistan also, there also I found that in the Jirga system, which is their traditional system, women are very active. And I mentioned about the local government system in Bangladesh. There also, we have social development committees where the gender component is mainstream, that it is mandatory to have women in all the committees. Even with the disaster management system, it is mandatory to have women included within it. So thank you. I'm really not sure from where the
No, that's great. And one last thing is, we didn't get to it, but really the inclusion of men as allies, because I know in our own history, the right to vote, the 19th Amendment would not have passed if not with collaboration, with relationships with men who saw the need for that kind of equality and representation. So let us not forget to have allies and partners in this, because it's not just a women's interest. So thank you all today. I appreciate your willingness to share your research, but your tireless work and commitment to implement gender-responsive institutional policy to influence human security and regional stability. I look forward to our continued collaboration and project development. Please keep the Women, Peace, and Security Office on your email. All right, Crystal, that's a wrap for us. Back to you.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to our speakers and our participants for joining us today. We hope you'll continue to stay engaged with Pacific Forum programming. which you can find out more about on our website, www.pacforum.org. We have forthcoming research papers on various topics related to women, peace, and security by our WPS fellows to be published in Pacific Forum's journal, Issues and Insights. So please stay tuned for these. And we would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to complete our post-event survey, which you can find the link to in the chat box now. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today, to Dr. Dee Sawyers for moderating this event, and to U.S. Indo-PACOM for making this event possible. We hope that you'll see you all at a future event.